Welcome to Duck Season Somewhere podcast. This episode is brought to you by the following sponsors. GetDucks.com, your proven source for the very best waterfowl hunting adventures. Argentina, Mexico, 6 whole continents worth. For 2 decades, we've delivered real duck hunts for real duck hunters. And USHuntList.com, because the next great hunt is closer than you think. Search our database of proven U.S. and Canadian outfits. Contact them directly with confidence. Trust is earned. By the numbers, 121 waterfowl subspecies bagged on 6 continents, 20 countries, 36 U.S. states, and growing. I spend upwards of 225 days per year chasing ducks, geese, and swans worldwide. And I don't choose shotguns for their brand name or the cool factor. Y'all know me way better than that. I've shot Benelli for over 2 decades. I continue shooting Benelli shotguns for their simplicity, utter reliability, and superior performance. Whether hunting near home or halfway across the world, that is the stuff that matters. Sit means sit and stay until it doesn't. No matter how well or how often trained, retrievers want those ducks as badly as we do, maybe even more. Chardog might be titled, but she's still just a dog. I'm over 50 years old and I still do dumb stuff, trust me. Retrievers are family. I wouldn't endanger my children near heavy traffic, and I'm not going to risk my dog jumping in front of blazing guns either. Gundog Outdoors' patented quick-release safety system is fully adjustable, tethers to any blind or stand, has titanium stakes for frozen ground, and a quick-release marine-grade shackle to quickly release Fido when the smoke clears. Visit GundogOutdoors.com. Connect with them on Instagram at Gundog Outdoors to see their growing line of Gundog safety and performance products. Enter hashtag GetDucks to receive 15% discount off of your first order. Boss Shot Shell's copper-plated bismuth tin alloy is the good old days again. Steel shots come a long way in the past 30 years, but will never, ever perform like good old-fashioned lead. Say goodbye to all that gimmicky, high recoil, compensation, science, hype, and hello to superior performance. Know your pattern, take ethical shots, make clean kills. That is the boss way. The good old days are now. It really is duck season somewhere for 365 days per year. Duck Season Somewhere takes me year-round to worldwide destinations where I visit with the most interesting people. I'm your host, Ramsey Russell. Join me here to listen to those conversations. Welcome back to Duck Season Somewhere. I've got in the mobile Duck Season Somewhere studio today Mr. Hank Burdine, local legend, hunter, and Mississippi Delta celebrity. How are you, Hank?
I'm doing fine, man. I'm glad to be down here with you. And whenever I see you, ain't no telling what we're going to end up talking about.
It ain't no telling what we're going to talk about. I think the same thing. You know, Hank, for those that don't know, you've got a book yourself, and I've read it. You know, now you've been a writer for a long time.
Well, not really. I lost my wife about 15, 16 years ago. We were living in Florida. And I wrote a little story about being down there in Florida. And about that time, Delta magazine had just come out with its first issue. And I read the issue and really liked it. It was all about Delta stories and Delta people. And had Lee and Pup McCarty with McCarty's pottery from Marigold on the cover. And I called and I said, I'd like to write a final word. And which is the last page in the magazine. It's about why I can't leave Mississippi, even though I was living in Florida at the time. And they called me after they ran it and asked me would I write a story on such and such. And I kind of really didn't want to write that. And I said, well, why don't I write one about this? Came up with an idea, and they said, that'd be good. Well, from that point on, after every issue, they called me back up, well, when you going to turn in your next story? They don't tell me what to write about. They just come up with an article, come up with a story, and that's what I write about.
But you've got a great theme. You know, God, it's funny you say why I can't leave Mississippi, because I can remember being a young man in my 20s in college and wanting to leave Mississippi, wanting to go out west and be a forester, be a biologist, and just, I love it out west, golly. But Something happened. I know somewhere along the way, I started having kids, started having a family, and Mississippi's home. It's freaking
Right
home.
back home.
And even though I've lived here in the hills, central Mississippi for since high school, since before high school, we moved down here when I was in 7th grade. The Delta is unto itself. I mean, it's like if you're born in the Delta, you're always the Delta.
That's correct. That's correct. I left about 1994, 95, did about a 15-year walkabout and moved my family out to West Cliff, Colorado. Lived up in the San Grado de Cristo mountain range, which was absolutely one of the most beautiful places I'd ever been in my life. My wife got sick with breast cancer, and we moved to Florida, in the Niceville, Florida area, across from Destin, Choctawhatchee Bay, to be closer to her family and closer to my operations in Mississippi at the farm and everything. And when I lost her, my daughter had about 3 years finishing up high school. So when she finished high school, I moved home. And I've often told people that if I never leave the state line of Mississippi again, I'll be happy. And they say, well, Hank, what if you want to go to Memphis? I said, well, Memphis is the capital of the Delta.
That's right.
And New Orleans is just right downriver. And between New Orleans and Memphis and Mobile, why I want to go anywhere else? I'm home right here.
Yeah.
And it's just something about the Delta and Mississippi itself that is so unique. And the thing about the Delta, too, to all of us that enjoy the outdoors so much, there's so much to do in the Mississippi Delta. If I often say around where I live and hunt that we work 9 months out of the year just so we can hunt 3 months out of the year.
That's right.
And deer hunting, turkey hunting, the duck hunting, that I've been involved in duck hunting just about all my life. My daddy was a big goose hunter. He after the 1927 flood, they came up with the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, and they were able to channelize the river, take a lot of these bends out, create a lot of these oxbow lakes. And in that program, they took the Greenville bends out, shortened the river by about 30-something miles, built the dike, the Greenville Harbor Dike, and created Lake Ferguson. At that point, folks that wanted one and could get one would have these big river boats. My daddy had a 48-foot twin-screw Matthews boat that he'd take out on the river and goose hunt off of. Fred Borderline's daddy, Big Joe Borderline, had a steel hull boat called the Gulf Pride. He was in the Gulf oil business. Big Joe Verdon had a boat. And these folks would go out on the river, and they were mainly goose hunters. And that's what they really enjoyed, and they would stay out there for a week at a time. You had the big boat, the Mr. Charlie, which was Charlie P. Williams' boat, and they would duck hunt for sport in the afternoon when the ducks would be coming in, the little breaks and sloughs and off the river and sandbars and all, but mainly they were goose hunters. The big duck hunting at that time in the 30s and 40s, when these big compounds such as Swan Lake, which is now a part of the Yazoo Wildlife Refuge, you had Lake Wapanaka outside of Memphis over in Arkansas. You had a lot of these other big flooded timber areas that were basically the duck hunting habitat where folks would go and hunt. Mm-hmm. Those that weren't hunting on the Mississippi River. You had breaks and slashes and sloughs and all these woods and everything where ducks would congregate. Had a lot of wood ducks in here, and you got to remember the Mississippi Flyway carries about 40% of all the duck population that migrates in America each year. Mm-hmm. And historically, coming out of the breeding grounds of Canada, they followed that river. And as the river flooded, the grass fields on the sandbars, the grass flats, and the thousands of acres of hardwood bottoms that would go underwater with the millions of tons of hardwood mass, your pecans, your pin oaks, your acorns, all of this food that the ducks followed. But duck hunting back in the 30s and 40s was not at all as big as it is right now.
No.
And it was at that time back in the 60s, I had lost my daddy. Sonny Rich, who was a tremendous trap shooter and one of my great mentors that I had in my life, helping once I lost my daddy, bringing me up and duck hunting and deer hunting. And I grew up hunting in Whiskey Chute, which was an old chute off the Mississippi River there at Longwood. which in those days was about 5 miles from Swan Lake. That was after Swan Lake had been taken over by the federal government. But here I was, 18, 19, 20 years old, going to college, trying to work in the daytime, but in the wintertime, come on, boy, let's go duck hunting. Well, his son, Mel Rich, was a dear friend of mine. And I remember hours on end sitting in that truck with Mr. Sonny Rich right on the bank of Whiskey Chute, about midway down the chute, listening to mallard ducks. He said, boy, you hear all them ducks out there? Yes, sir, Mr. Sonny. He just sat there with his ear out to wonder, be cold as it could be, listening to ducks. And after about 20, 30 minutes, he said, son, that's where I'm going to send you to first thing in the morning. I'd get so excited I couldn't stand it. But Whiskey Chute was too thick, too tight to take a boat out in. You had to wade out in there with chest waders.
Huh.
Well, where he would send me was about, the depth of the water was about 2 inches below the top of them chest waders. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to swim out of Whiskey Chute. But it wasn't until several years later that I realized what Mr. Sonny Rich was doing.
Uh-huh.
He'd always go down on the west end of Whiskey Chute where it was much shallower. It was about 2 feet thick, 2 feet deep down there, and there was a bunch of hardwood trees down there. Well, Sonny Rich was a national champion trap shooter. And he shot a Winchester 21 duck grade gun, which is a full choked gun, 3-inch Magnum Winchester. And every now and then during the daytime, those ducks would come into me and I'd shoot and do what I could do. I wasn't that good of a shot back then. And then normally about an hour or so into the deal, I'd hear him hollering, come on up here, boy, come on up here. What he doing the whole time, he knew I wasn't going to kill many ducks. And he knew that's where those ducks wanted to go, was right where he sent me. But as soon as I'd shoot at them ducks, they'd fly straight to the end of Whiskey Chute. They'd make that turn right over those tall trees where he was, and he'd drop them every time he'd pull that trigger. I'd go down there, and he had an old Chesapeake dog back then, and he had trained that dog, or whether that dog trained himself. I never saw Mr. Rich miss a duck. When that duck came over, and he didn't call that much. He didn't have to because he knew what those ducks were going to do. And yes, he was past shooting them, but he knew the length that he could shoot. He knew how to kill those ducks, and he did. And that Chesapeake would go out and pick that duck up and bring it to that log he was standing by, and he would line those ducks up precisely on that log with the heads in the same direction. You'd look down there may be 8 ducks, however many the limit was at that time. Never shot over the limit, of course. But he'd line those ducks up, and if one of them ducks flopped down or fell off, that dog would pick it up and lay it right back on that log.
Right back on the log.
Right back on the log. So I was able to grow up wait a minute.
So Mr. Rich had a Chesapeake Bay Retriever to line them ducks up, and he had a Hank Burdine helper to help push them ducks over to him.
He helped flying those ducks away from me, pushing them straight to him. And we didn't put out decoys. He knew that those ducks were going to fly to the end of that Whiskey Chute and make that turn right over the treetop height and turn and head back around. And that's all he'd do. When he'd hear me shoot, he'd get ready. Go, here come the ducks.
And then you would go and join him and finish up shooting your ducks?
And then I'd go up and join him sometimes when he'd holler at me. And I'll never forget one morning, Dr. Eustace Wynn came down there. He was a wonderful doctor, a surgeon there in Greenville. Showed up down there at the cow sale barn first thing in the morning, about 4:30, 5 o'clock, driving that Cadillac, pulled out a box of Converse waders. And we was all sitting in there getting ready to go, and he said, come here, boy, and help me pull these waders on. Dr. Wynn was a big man. So I got him in them chest waders, and he goes down there with Sonny Rich on that end down there, and he's shooting a Model 12 pump, 3-inch Magnum. Just like I had. I was shooting my daddy's Model 12 3-inch pump. Well, finally they called me up there, and then I came on up there after I realized what the game was. And we had a wonderful hunt, got all our limits. And so we get back to the sale barn there where we was dressing all up, and Dr. Wynn looked at his watch, and he was trying to get those waders off. Now, this was a brand-new pair of Converse waders that we just put on him 2 hours before. And he looked at his watch. He said, I got to operate in 30 minutes. I said, well, let's get them waders off. Well, He reached in Sonny Rich's drawer, pulled out a case pocket knife. He said, "Cut these boots off me, boy. I got to be operating in 30 minutes." I put on a brand new pair of $100 waders and cut them off of him within 2 hours. But that was the kind of duck hunting that I came up with in that time. And then as I got a little older in college and was developing my place at Willow Run, and we didn't have four-wheelers back then, didn't have three-wheelers. Honda Big Red hadn't come out yet. I had one of the first three-wheelers. It was an Adventurer three-wheeler made somewhere down in Louisiana. One wheel up front, two in the back, and had the motor sitting between your legs. But it wasn't at all like a regular three-wheeler was back then. And we used to have to hunt out of these red ball waders. We didn't have all the mossy oak camouflage, the different gear that you have today. You'd go to the Army-Navy store. You may remember the Army-Navy store.
I do.
You'd buy these old Army coats. Well, as soon as they got wet, here's the worst thing, coldest thing in the world. And we didn't have these nylon mesh decoy bags. You put them in a croaker sack. And they were old cork decoys, and they were heavy, and it'd take you an hour sometime to slog a half mile out across a bean field to get to a slash. Well, what began happening at that time is rice was beginning to be farmed in the Mississippi Delta. They were beginning to level land. The Mennonite group were the big dirt movers back then, and I remember some of the first dirt that I moved on my farm and on some road jobs we had at the time were these double-barreled dirt buggies. They had two tractors hooked, tongue, front and back, and two buckets behind those two tractors, and that supplied the horsepower. And when they would shower down on those tractors, that front tractor would stand straight up in the air, and the driver was on there, and that's how we was moving dirt. Well, by this time, I had been developing Willow Run down there, had some wonderful breaks and sloughs on that place, and flooded bean fields where the water went out into beans, and had great duck hunting. And after about 4 or 5 years, I realized that my ducks were diminishing. And Sonny Rich would always tell me, he said, "Now, son, if you want to kill ducks, there's nothing you can do to make a duck come into where you want him to go. A duck is going to go where he wants to go. You can put food out there. If he doesn't necessarily want to come visit it, he's not going to." And I said, well, something is happening, because I used to have ducks. And I got up in an airplane and flew and looked around Leroy Percy Park, and the park itself looked like a forested oasis in an ocean of water. The fields had been leveled. They were holding field in water in rice fields, holding water in bean fields. The flooded fields that the farmers were leaving out for duck hunting began to pull the ducks away from the natural habitat that I had. So that is what I think we're seeing now. You've got a lot of areas, a lot of farmers have become attuned to the fact that they can flood fields and they can hunt them. Some of them are leasing them out, selling hunting leases, and the ducks are getting scattered. There's a lot of food out there for the ducks. We're planting a lot of corn now, which we didn't plant when I grew up hunting. So you've got cornfields, you've got rice. I've tried to grow rice for ducks, but I found out that the blackbirds come in and eat all the rice up. And so I'm getting more and more attuned to more soil habitat foods that you can fertilize and grow these barnyard grasses and try to keep the broadleaf weeds out of them. And that is the natural food that the ducks have been involved in all along. I was involved in, not a member of, but the Fighting Bow Hunting Club.
Yeah.
Outside of Ruleville.
Talk about that, Hank.
Knew all those boys, the Skipper Jernigans, the Bubba Tollisons, the George Lotta Horses, the Billy Van Davender, all that group of Dr. Charles Laney, Dr. Bush down here, Dr. Barrett. Such a great, good group of people. And that is an area outside of Ruleville that, according to Skipper, will flood on a heavy dew. It's in the bottom of what's called Booger Den. I'm a Rule from Ruleville and know a lot about that area up there. And ducks have been coming there, as Skipper Jernigan says, since man's memory retaineth not to the contrary. So it is a natural area. that is timber that floods out, and those ducks just have been flocking in there forever and ever. Amen. And it's a wonderful club that was originally put together by some folks down here in Jackson that came up there and leased some land and hunted on it. And then a gentleman named Mr. P.L. Blake had it for a while and had big fancy hunting stands out there in the different holes, the Wansley Hole, the different types of areas out through there, but mostly it's timber hunting. And when you're in there, the water's not ankle deep, but it's no more than knee deep, where you're standing out here, and it's a sight to behold to be in flooded timber no matter where it is, whether it's the York Woods, the Cocola Woods, Fighting Bow, areas like that. When those mallards want to come in there, they circle and they come in by the thousands. And I've seen some mornings when we just choose, and I've done this on my place very rarely, but up in areas like that oftentimes more, when sometimes you just won't raise your gun. You just want to see what happens, and you just sit there, and it's a great thing. B.C. Rogers, a friend of mine, talks about, God's own church. When you can't go to church on Sunday, you're going to be out duck hunting. You're as close to God in a duck swamp and a set of flooded woods than you are sitting in a church with a cathedral on top of it, with a steeple on top of it. It's just it's something that raises the hair on the back of my head.
Sure.
And there was one time I had a dog named Bud, which was a big red Chesapeake Bay Retriever. And it's often said that a man is due two things in life, a good woman and a good dog. And I've had both. And my big dog, Bud, was one hell of a dog. I'm going to tell you, he had a lot more sense than a lot of folks I knew, to tell you the truth. But now I've got little Boykin Spaniels, which have Chesapeake blood bred into them. I've got a picture of my daddy's boat taken in 1938 of a Boykin Spaniel laying on the console inside that boat. So I didn't realize it at the time, but my daddy had a Boykin Spaniel. So my last Boykin Spaniel, named Boogie Woogie, call him Boogie for short, he and I were sitting out in a Lost 40 duck hole one morning, just Boogie and I was drinking coffee. I hadn't even loaded my gun up, and it was just beginning to try to get light. A duck hunter knows that moment. It's that moment when all of a sudden the temperature drops about 3 or 4 degrees, and you know something is fixing to happen, and that first inkling of the sunlight begins to smudge itself in the east. And the wind was blowing a little bit, and it stopped blowing, and I poured myself another cup of coffee, and ducks started coming in. Well, I hadn't loaded my gun. I was shooting a double barrel at the time. And my dog looked at these ducks coming in and looked at me and knew I hadn't even loaded my gun. And all of a sudden, I felt a cold blast of air hit me in the face. And I raised my eyes up and I looked around. And I'm choking up thinking about this because I got to thinking about all the duck hunters, the old duck hunters that I knew that had helped raise me, that had helped bring me up, and had brought me into duck hunting as I know it and as I love it today. And I got to thinking about all these old duck hunters, and I began thinking further, and I said, where are these old duck hunters? And all of a sudden, I realized they were all gone. And another cold blast of air hit me, and it dawned on me that at this stage in the game now, I am one of the old duck hunters. And I got to thinking about other friends of mine that I've grown up duck hunting with. The Sid Laws, the Chuck Cages, the Bubba Tollisons, the George Van Landinghams, all of these people that are in my age group that have hunted all our lives and are now teaching young ones, grandchildren, children in the duck hunting tradition. And I got to thinking about these folks, and I decided that I would have what I called an old duck hunter's dinner. And I called my friend Cameron Dinkins, got Esperanza Outdoors over across the lake, and beautiful old home over there on the bank of Lake Washington at Linden Plantation. And we put together an old duck hunter's dinner. And I invited Sid Bo Weaver Law, I invited Chuck Cage, I invited Bubba Tollison's son, Zach, because Bubba's no longer with us. I had George Van Landingham, and of course Cameron Dinkins was there with us, and Stuart Robertson. I had Joe Verdon there. Joe was another one that was of the older duck hunter group that brought me along, taught me how to blow a duck call. And I asked them all, and I wanted Jimmy Presswood to be there. Jimmy Presswood was the one that devised and built and had the concept of the ugly duck boat that we can talk about later on. And I asked them all to come, and I said, bring your duck calls with you. Bring your lanyard with you, because I knew a lot of these people had a good number of duck bands on their lanyards. I had a house fire that burned up my first lanyard full of duck bands. And so we all came, had a wonderful dinner, and then we sat around and we started telling old duck hunting stories. And at one time I said, I want everybody to bring out their duck calls. And we had a little duck calling exhibition. I said, now I want you to lay those calls on this rug and let's take a picture of them. There were 7 duck lanyards laying on the rug. And on those 7 lanyards were 550 duck bands. Now that's a lot of duck bands, and every one of those bands were taken within a 70 or 80 mile radius of Greenville, Mississippi. Now some of y'all duck hunters can do your math on it, but from what I have seen and what I've understood and what I've checked records at Fighting Bayou and different areas that I've hunted and talked to different people, it's anywhere from 250 to 350 ducks that is harvested per band. And when you run the numbers on 550 bands, on 300 ducks a band, that's almost 16,000 ducks between these 7 gentlemen that were there. And Jimmy Presswood's duck strap was not there. Some of them had over 100 bands on them. And that's not talking about the goose bands, but duck bands only. So when you think of that, and you look at the area that we're hunting in, and that's the Mississippi River, the big wooded areas, the big timbered areas, your flooded bean and rice fields and corn fields now, that's a lot of ducks. It's a duck mecca. And you've got the confluence of the Arkansas River coming in around Big Island at Rosedale, and it is a duck magnet down here. And some of the best duck hunting, of course, is once the freezes come in and your bean field and your rice field and corn field freeze up. If you got a rising river, then that's the time to hit the river and duck hunt. But the problem with that is, and I did it too many times as a youngster, I refuse to do it now, is your safety factor in hunting that Mississippi River. If you're not in a safe boat, a big boat, don't go out there. Now, I've hunted too many times in little John boats out there before day that it's not necessary anymore. Now, along about the 60s, Lake Whittington was a very hot spot to duck hunt on. And they were building floating blinds out there, and they were trying to build permanent blinds in some of the willow trees and the middle ground and the grass flats and all. But on a permanent blind in a lake like that, it may be 6 feet out of water one weekend and 4 feet underwater the next weekend. Mm-hmm. A floating blind, not necessarily, is always in the right place. The ducks may be using another area. There's a fellow named Jimmy Presswood from Greenville who was a master welder and fitter, and he loved to duck hunt, yet he hated to get cold. And he came up with an idea to design a floating duck blind that was mobile, that he could move from one place to the other wherever the ducks were using. The first generation of what we now call an ugly duck boat, Jimmy would sit in it and have his hand outside running the motor. Well, that didn't last too long until it was morphed into what was called the original ugly duck boat. And it was a low-slung boat made of steel that was 6 feet wide, 12, 14 feet long, had a walkboard around the side of it, positive flotation. Anywhere you could put in it had positive flotation. and it had a top on it that was hinged that would raise up that 3 men could get in with a dog. And when you closed that top, the other side of it, the port side, was slanted, and it had 3 portholes, 3 holes cut in it that you had sliding plexiglass you could raise up and down. And you'd camouflage that boat. You had your gas tanks on the outside. You had a propane tank on the outside. You had a propane burner inside the boat. You turn it on, it'd warm up like your bedroom in there. When you got out to where you wanted to hunt, you'd throw your decoys out. Jimmy had rigged up a flop-down dog ladder on the bow of the boat where your dog could work off the bow of the boat and could come climb himself right back up on the boat without any trouble, without you having to reach over and grab him and pull him back in the boat. And the boat was a lethal weapon for killing ducks. But there was only one problem. Jimmy hunted in Lake Whittington. He didn't like to get out in the river. He'd kill all the ducks he wanted right there in Lake Whittington. Yet, when you would take one of these boats out, he had some friends, Jerry Bricada, Dr. Bordelon, Ernie Lane, Dr. Joe Pulliam, all the Brents, Howard and Lee Brent, they all got it. Joe, Jimmy, you got to build us one of these boats. Got to build us one of these boats. They were made out of steel, but they had a flat bottom and a flat bow on the front because Jimmy wasn't rigged up to build a modified V hull. So when you take that boat out on the Mississippi River, it almost beat the fillings out your teeth. Didn't bother Jimmy because he hunted in the lake. He didn't get out in the river with the big waves and the current. So the third generation of Jimmy Presswood boats. Now, when Jimmy first built that first one that was totally enclosed with the motor on the outside, he took it to the lake. Somebody came up and saw it, and he said, Jimmy, I don't know what that is. If it's a duck boat, it's the ugliest duck boat I've ever seen, which it was pretty ugly. But the name stuck. So it became known as Jimmy Presswood Ugly Duck Boat. Now, after Jimmy was making that first series of the second generation of boats, they went over to, and he couldn't make a V-hull boat. They went over to Monarch Boat Company in Monticello, Arkansas, and he had F&F welding fabrication shop. You see a lot of F&F boats out there now, but they're no longer manufacturing boats. They would build the hull, the modified V-hull, bring it back over there to Presswood Welding, and he would build the top to fabricate on the top of it. Now we've got boats like that access this river, and they have 50 or 100-mile range. You can go to where the ducks are. But back into the 70s, in the late 70s and early 80s, when we were hunting, you never knew where the ducks were going to be. So you ride the river until you see some ducks go up and then go in there and hunt them. Well, we'd fly the airplane. We'd fly J3 Cubs. You could find the ducks by the air, then mark it on a map, and go right back the next morning. These boats were safe, they were comfortable, and you could get in the water, go to the ducks before daybreak, get set up, and as the sun came up, you were off and hunting. So it was a very effective way to hunt big water in a very dangerous river situation. You were in a good wide bottom, safe hulled boat. Grits Gresham came down here and did a whole series on duck hunting in America. One of them was caged birds up in New England, which I don't even get me started on that. And then they had another hunt somewhere, and then they came to Greenville, Mississippi. And we put 2 duck boats in the river. And we put the film crew in an airplane to try to find these boats on the Mississippi River. And at one point in time, whoever was in the airplane with the pilot and the film guy, they couldn't find the boats. They were so well concealed. That's how so camouflaged you can make these boats. And Grits Gresham was in a boat and with Jimmy, talking to Jimmy about those boats and the concept of the ugly duck boat. And he asked Jimmy, he said, Jimmy, how often do you hunt? And without just look straight at him, he said, Grits, I hunt every day of the season, no matter what the weather is. And he did. Every day of however long the season was, Jimmy Presswood hunted. And Grits asked him, he said, Jimmy, I have to tell you one thing, though. This boat looks like a coffin. And without batting an eye, Jimmy Presswood looked at him and he said, Grits, it is to the ducks.
Absolutely. Tell me this. You mentioned Swan Lake several times earlier in the podcast, and I can just recall the dozens, not many, but just a couple of dozen photos my grandfather had. He was born and raised around Washington County, Mississippi too, but he had I remember seeing a picture of him holding a strap of ducks down in Swan Lake. Tell me about Swan Lake. Where is it? What is it?
Swan Lake was an old riverbed of the Mississippi River. If you Google it up, it's right there at Yazoo Wildlife Refuge. And then from there, you had another oxbow, which was Lake Washington. And from there, you had another oxbow, which is Lake Jackson. And then you got the Mississippi River. So it's an old historical bend in the Mississippi River. There were landowners inside on the islands and outside of the old Swan Lake bed that were landowners, and they incorporated the Swan Lake Hunting Club in 1893. It today is the oldest incorporated hunting club in the state of Mississippi. The landowners that owned the land to the middle of the lake were landowning members of the club, and they took in maybe 20 other members in this hunting club. Swan Lake had the perpetual hunting rights on over 5,000 acres of the Swan Lake bed. And back in those days, I've got a lot of the recorded history on it, a lot of the minutes from the different meetings that they had. In the 20s and 30s, before they had legal limits, the way they hunted Swan Lake, there was only 2 blinds in that whole 5,000-acre lake, but they had trails that ran all through the lake, and different. You had Gin Slough, you had Long Pond, and you had all these flooded cypress trees, hardwood bottom land in there, and grass flats in there. And they had what is called the old Swan Lake duck boat, which I have the only one remaining in existence. They were cypress, double-hulled, flat-bottomed boats with duck boards in the bottom of them. And what you did, the shooter would sit in the front of the boat in a slat-back, cane-bottom chair with the legs cut off of it. And a man would stand in the back with a pole, and he'd pole you through these trails. And they came up with their own limit of ducks in the Swan Lake Hunting Club. And that limit was the number of shells you carried into the swamp in your boat. And you could not carry any more than 100 shells into the swamp.
Wow.
However many ducks you killed with that 100 shells, that was your limit.
Wow. So
it was a primeval area where ducks had been coming for the millennia. And the federal government came up with the U.S. duck stamp, charging $2 a duck stamp back then. And those duck stamps were designed to fund a program of putting land back into habitat as waterfowl reserves up and down the Mississippi Flyway and other places also, but primarily it was in the Mississippi Flyway that a lot of that money was used. As the timber companies cleared the land around Swan Lake and all, and some of the farm owners that owned some of the land, the government came down there and bought up a huge, huge chunk of that area down through there. And the last part that they bought contained the old Swan Lake bed. And that area had been given perpetual hunting rights to the Swan Lake Hunting Club of the old Swan Lake bed. The government took that hunting right by eminent domain. The lawyer Jimmy Robertshaw, who was a member of the club, took it all the way to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and lost. So the Swan Lake Hunting Club went into the Yazoo Wildlife Refuge system. And at the turn of this past century, they came up with the Corps of Engineers came up with a program to compartmentalize the Swan Lake bed into 4 different compartments. And the idea was to capture good water during the rainy season to put into the Swan Lake bed, yet keep the bad pesticide and chemical-ridden water out of there during the planting season. Well, they built all these dikes, and I'm not going to get into it too much because I know too much about it, but those dikes didn't stay there. They sunk into the swamp bed. They built them 3 or 4 different times. The system didn't work. Where they channelized to tie in Silver Lake to the Steel Bow, where Black Bow comes into Steel's Bow, they channelized a whole stretch through there. That kept sloughing off. Now they've had to redo that completely and build a whole new project. And I'm afraid basically it hadn't totally done away with the compartmentalized idea, but we're not holding the water. We're not having the ducks in there that we had over the last 100 years that we've got recorded history down there. So.
And you grew up hunting there at Swan Lake back before it was condemned.
My dad had died in 1961. He was a member of Swan Lake Hunting Club. They gave me his membership in 1962. I was 13 years old, a full-fledged member of Swan Lake Hunting Club, and that was the year that the government condemned it and took it over. So I never was able to hunt down there. I had breakfast down there with Sonny Rich one time.
You know, their policy back in the day of exercising eminent domain to condemn a piece of property that they wanted, which is, as I understand it, Hank, you clear it up if I'm wrong. They just come in and say, we're taking it and here's what we're going to give you. It ain't a negotiated sale. It's just whether that property's for sale or not, the U.S. federal government comes in and says, here's the check and this is all we're going to give you. We're going to take it because we like it. And we actually had a guest on here not too long ago who was a former federal agent in that refuge complex right after all this happened. And he said, man, it was not a good PR stunt for the federal government. It really rankled a lot of feathers and everything else locally. People have been hunting that property, or properties, plural, for generations.
And taking care of it.
Yeah.
And doing what needed to be done. And, yes, that is the case, or was the case back then. Now that couldn't happen.
Yeah.
So had they waited about 10 or 15 years, we'd still have Swan Lake Hunting Club down there. Which was a great magnet. It was a sump for all of Washington County where that water would come in there, and the ducks, it was a duck magnet.
Yeah.
And, it was in 3/4 of a mile of whiskey shoot. So, you could pattern your ducks. When they had ducks in Swan Lake, you had ducks everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Boy, duck hunting in the South especially, but I think everywhere, it really is a social sport, isn't it? I mean, it's a common thing. You and I, first time we met, were at Doe's Eat Place in Greenville, Mississippi, and every time we start visiting about duck hunting, it just starts spinning into friends and people and places. You see what I'm saying? Like a real social thing. It ain't like a solitary deer hunter going out on a stand to go draw back.
That's
on
right.
a bow.
I can't bow hunt because I'm sitting up in a tree in a stand with a bow. Oh, no way.
Bored.
Now I can get in a big deer stand where I got a book. I can be doing on my telephone or such as that.
Yeah.
But duck hunting is such a social sport where you got 2 or 3 good buddies in there with you, and you're talking about this and talking about that, and you're able to talk, and you're able to have the camaraderie and the just being together out in God's great outside, out of doors. And turkey hunting, when I used to have turkeys, I loved to turkey hunt because I was interacting with those turkeys. Mm-hmm. You can't call it well. You can call a deer, but not like you can a turkey or a duck.
Right.
But to be able to work a duck call and to know what the ducks want to hear when they're doing a certain thing and their flight patterns and all, it's an art to do that. And the worst thing in a duck blind is somebody that doesn't know how to call a duck.
Oh, boy, and that's the truth. I think it's one of the most overused tools there is in duck hunting. I mean, you said it previously, if you're where the ducks want to be.
That's true. You can give them a little quack or two every now and then. Forget about all that high balling now. If they're flying up, trying to go somewhere, and you trying to call them back, yeah, that's one thing. But if the ducks are working there and they're coming in, be quiet.
That's
Let
right.
them come on in. They see what you're doing. That was way before we had all these flapping wing ducks and mojo ducks and all like that. And a jerk cord is one of the most effective things that I've seen you can use. And it'll keep you warm sometime too, because you exercise and pulling on that jerk cord.
Yep.
But I go back to Jimmy Presswood. I remember one time we were hunting over on, well, we might not have should have been hunting where we were, but we were, and I had Jimmy Presswood. We'd come over there in a couple of his boats, and we were sitting out on a log and had old Bubba Bueller with us. And Bubba was supposed to be the man in charge of the jerk cord. Well, he got tired of jerking that cord with his arm, so he just tied it around his waist. And he's sitting out there in the water, waist deep water, going back and forth. Well, he not only was pulling the ducks, making the ducks move, he's creating waves. So that's a great way to make a duck cord, a jerk cord do. But Jimmy Presswood was sitting on the log with me, and I'd never hunted with Jimmy before. And all of a sudden I looked over at him, and he began shaking and was shivering, and he's turning blue. I said, Jimmy, are you okay? He said, Hank, I ain't never been this cold in my life. Well, it wasn't that cold. I said, Jimmy, wait a minute. You've been duck hunting all your life, and you've never been this cold? He said, Hank, I have never until today hunted in anything but tennis shoes and blue jeans.
Oh.
Because he's always in his duck boat.
Always in that duck boat. Hank, I know this is a reach. I get asked this question some myself, but if I asked you one of your most memorable duck hunts, what's the first thing come to mind?
Whoa.
I know.
I'm gonna tell you two of them. One of them was on a morning in Fighting By when we got lost. It was a New Year's morning. And I was with my partner Tommy Sledge, Skipper Jernigan, and maybe one more. Dr. Barrett might have been with us. And we were going to one place after you draw the card to figure out where you're going to hunt. To, you know how the card draw goes. Who gets the higher card goes to that place. And we were going to a good spot, but we got lost in those woods. And it was getting daybreak. And we said, we just stop the boat. We'll find ourselves later on. We got out of the boat in the thickest part of the woods I think I've ever been in. And when that sun came up, it just happened that was where the ducks wanted to be.
Wow. And
those ducks were knocking themselves out, falling down through those trees. And if you've ever seen a duck coming into a set of flooded timber right at daybreak, and he's hitting tree limbs, knocking limbs off, knocking himself over here, trying to get to that water, that was one of the most memorable duck hunts I've ever been on. The other one was we were doing a story for Delta Magazine. And I was up there hunting with Skipper, and the editor was going to be there that day, and I didn't realize that until I saw her walk in the door at 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning. And with John Munford Jones was there. He was going to be the photographer. So I asked Skipper, I said, Skipper, if you don't mind, can I please beg off going with your group and go with them, because I wrote for Delta Magazine, and I wanted to go with them. And they were going to go with Bubba Tollison. Now, I don't know if a lot of y'all folks know who Bubba Tollison was, but he was called the Duck Doctor. And I don't mind telling this because I've gotten into this in an article before about him. One of the baddest federal game wardens there ever was of all time was a man named Jimmy Pilgreen. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Pilgreen, I think, spent half of his career trying to catch Bubba Tollison. And he finally did. That's a whole nother story. But Jimmy Pilgreen told me when I called him and interviewed him about that article, he said, Hank, I'm going to tell you something about Bubba Tollison. He said he was one of the best duck hunters that I've ever known. And coming from a federal game warden that had been trying to catch him for a long time, that says a lot about Bubba Tollison. Mm-hmm. Now, that morning we were going to the Wansley Hole or wherever it is in Fighting Bow we were going to, and Bubba Tollison was the guide of that group, and I asked to go with him, and I did. So they were set up. The editor, she was sitting over on one little old dog stand, and Don Munford was taking pictures. Well, Bubba Tollison and I were standing in the middle of the hole after we'd put all our decoys out. No duck showed up. We never saw a duck. We never loaded the gun. But I sat in the middle of those woods with Bubba Tollison, as we were talking about earlier. And I think that may very well be the best duck hunt I ever spent.
Why?
We never loaded a gun. We never saw a duck. But Bubba Tollison and I sat in the middle of those woods and talked for an hour and a half. And I can't say that that's not the best duck hunt I've ever been on.
What's a good story, Hank? What'd y'all talk about, if you don't mind me asking?
Everything about ducks we could talk about. And I realized at that time that it's never a disaster when you're learning and listening to a master.
Yeah.
And Bubba Tolleson was a master duck hunter. He often said that if you had enough wind to rustle a gnat's wing, you better take note of it, because the ducks knew it.
I remember reading in your book a little bit about Bubba Tolleson and some of his. Tell me more about Bubba.
Bubba Tolleson and Archie Manning grew up together. Archie was from Drew, Bubba was from Rule, and Bubba could run faster than lightning. And he and Archie, their senior year in high school, in the All-Star game down here in Jackson, and they went to one of the sports reporters, and the sports reporter said to Bubba, says, well, Bubba, says, how many folks you reckon from Rule and Drew going to be down here in Jackson watching this All-Star game with Archie Manning and Bubba Tolleson? Bubba says, well, Captain, whatever his name was, he said, there ain't going to be nobody left in Rule and Drew but the night watchman. But Bubba and Hugh Arant, one of his dearest friends from outside of Rule, a big rice farmer, farms all around out yonder. Bubba said, Hugh Arant said the only time he'd ever been invited to go duck hunting on his own place was by Bubba Tolleson. Bubba called him one time and said, hey, called him Black Hand. And the reason Bubba called Hugh Arant Black Hand, they had all this old farm equipment. Hugh always had grease on his hand. Now, I don't know whether it was the grease being on that hand all his life, but I've never seen Hugh Arant with a pair of gloves on in my life. And I can be absolutely shivering about to freeze to death and my hand's blue, and Hugh Arant be sitting there reaching his hand in the water and all like that. But Bubba called him one time and said, hey, Hugh, Black Hand, said, man, I done found a mess of duck. You want to go duck hunting in the morning? Hugh said, yeah, Bubba, where we going? He said, that 40 acres right south on your farm. Said, from your house, said, that's where we going to go in the morning. So Bubba grew up duck hunting. He's the only man I've ever seen, and I've seen his duck band, and I've counted the bands on it, and his duck strap, and I'm not going to tell you how many bands it is, but it was one of those I spoke of earlier. He has a blackbird band on it.
Oh.
Now, I don't know if anybody has ever seen a blackbird band, but back in the days during the high school in the 50s and 60s, you've seen these swarm of blackbirds that fly over.
Yeah.
You say you could shoot a 22 up there and, kill one of them. Well, they would go out on the turn rows, and they would have a dime a bird.
Wow.
On whoever killed the many blackbirds, you'd get a dime a bird, and they'd want to get the money. Well, here come a flock of them. Bubba reached up there, boom, pulled the trigger. Blackbird fell, went and picked it up, had a band on it.
Wow.
So on Bubba's back, on Bubba's duck strap, he's got a blackbird band. Bubba he messed his eye up. He reloaded some shotgun shells, and one of them didn't do right, and he messed the eye up, and that got him out of the football game at Ole Miss. He was a wide receiver. Running, whatever. He could run like lightning. And he went to Ole Miss with Archie Manning and George Lauderhouse and Billy Van Davender and Skipper Jernigan. That's why they were all such close friends, because they all played football together. But his eyesight getting banged up and beat up in the head, they said, no, he can't do this anymore. So Bubba didn't play much more football, but it did not stop him from duck hunting.
I believe I read that story you talked about with Pilgrim chasing him.
Right.
Did he must have shot a bunch of birds. I mean, because that was back in the day. Look, I'm not beating up on a man. I'm saying times were different.
Totally different.
Times were different 20, 30 years ago than they are today. You
had the point system on certain years, and I never could figure all those things out. And then but there was a stretch through there about 6 or 8 years, I believe, where the duck population was way down.
Yeah.
Way down. But, you can get that book, Dust in the Road, Recollections of a Delta Boy, that I have out by Coopwood Publishing, and read about the duck doctor in there.
Very, very good book, by the way. I read it recently and enjoyed it greatly. How have things changed in the Mississippi Delta other than the zero grade? I mean, some people say maybe there aren't as many ducks as there were back in those days. What are your thoughts on that, Hank?
I think we still have the ducks. There are certain areas that are harboring a lot more ducks than other places. Mm-hmm. There are certain magnet areas. Growing up, I think we had a lot of ducks that followed the Mississippi Flyway and hung close to the Mississippi River. The Corps of Engineers projects, the 4 lakes over there, Arca, Butler, Enid, Sardis, and Grenada, were built as flood control reservoirs and to control the water coming out of the hills. And for years, they weren't necessarily used as flood control reservoirs. They would keep water in it for the folks to fish in the wintertime. They love to duck hunt in those lakes, so they hold water in it. Then after 73 and into the 80s, they realized that they really need to start using these lakes for what they were built for, as flood control reservoirs. So what I think began to happen, they started dumping these lakes in the fall. And they started flooding these Tallahatchie River bottoms out earlier than they normally were flooded. And I think that the ducks began an eastward migration beginning to move over. Now, I may be totally wrong in that, but that's my take on it, that because the lakes were being dumped earlier, and you can go over there now, Tallahatchie River's chock full. They're dumping all that water. Mm-hmm. So all of those river bottoms are filling up with ducks. So there's water in there when the ducks are beginning to come down here. And the fact that we used to be known as the mound builders, the Indians around here building all these mounds around. Now we're known as the land levelers. The leveled land for agriculture is better than your center pivots. It's more economical once you get that land leveled. So a lot of these areas on these farms are being leveled and catching water in the wintertime. Mm-hmm. It does twofold things. It gets rid of a lot of grass seeds. It kills the grass seeds under the water. Plus, it produces habitat for the ducks. And the ducks, as you know, use different things during the course of the year. They're eating hot cereal certain times. They're eating one thing one time. And then you've gone out in rice fields toward the end of the duck season and saying, I've seen ducks get sideways and just strip of the little amoebas, the little stuff off of those stalks, and getting that for the building the calcium up for their egg bearing and all this kind of stuff. So different times during the year, and there's so much more water. There's so much more habitat for them out there. Right. It's just like dove hunting. Used to be you could scatter some wheat out in a wheat field, you'd have doves come in. Now, with the corn harvest that goes on, there's so much scattered corn grain out there. If you don't have a jam-up, show enough good sunflower field, you ain't going to have a dove hunt. That's right. But what I have found out, the best way to have a good sunflower field is to have a neighbor that has one.
That's right.
And then you go hunt with him.
That's why I call you buddy Chuck Cage.
There you go. Oh, Chuck. We can tell some stories about my buddy Chuck Cage. He is and has been as dedicated a duck hunter as anyone that I know. I don't know how much involved guiding in it he is now. I think his son's doing a whole lot of it. But Chuck would not only, like Jimmy Presswood would hunt every day, he was just hunting out of a boat in Lake Whittington. Chuck Cage would hunt over an 80-mile area.
Oh, my gosh, everywhere.
And you'd see him at Doe's one night, and then he'd be duck hunting the next morning. He'd be at the Varsity and Bell's Owner for lunch, and he'd be scouting that afternoon and duck hunting somewhere else the next morning. I personally don't know how he did it, but he did.
He did. But I think he still does. He's a heck of a guy.
If there's ever anybody I wanted on my team, is Chuck Cage.
Yes, sir.
And no matter what I was involved in.
Yes, sir. I appreciate your time, Hank. Folks, y'all have been listening to my friend, Mr. Hank Burdine. Tell me the name of your book one more time in case they want to read that.
Dust in the Road, Recollections of a Delta Boy.
There you go.
By Coopwood Publishing out of Cleveland, Mississippi.
Hank Burdine, Delta Boy Extraordinaire. Thank y'all for listening to this episode of Duck Season Somewhere.